Hello everyone! Today I want to tell you about 15 tips for hard surface modeling that I personally think I should have learned way sooner. So without wasting much time, let's dive straight into it. Tip number 1. Mimic how objects in real life are built. When modeling something that exists in real life, it's a good idea to roughly mimic the building process of the object. So let's take a simple chair as an example. So this is your usual wooden chair, right? So let's break this down into all its separate pieces and copy them in Blender. All the legs are separate pieces. The front legs are shorter, so let's create those first and then we're gonna create the back legs. Then we have those horizontal connecting struts between all the legs, which are also separate pieces. So let's first build those upper ones and then the two down here. Up here there are 4 bigger struts forming the base of the chair, so let's build those. And on top of them we have the sitting area, so there we go. And the backrest is once again connected by 2 big struts to give it some stability, so let's add those. And finally we have those pads attached down here. And there we go, we have our chair now fully assembled in Blender and all the pieces are separated. Now you can take all those pieces, join them together with Ctrl and J, and then simply give the chair a material, and it's done. In my opinion, mimicking the building process of things like that makes them look more convincing, more detailed and more realistic. And it also makes it easier for you to make reasonable modifications to the shape, because you somewhat know the logic behind what those different parts are supposed to do. For example, you could now add some nails to the chair, making a logical connection between the objects. Which is a nice transition to my second tip. Tip number 2. Connections between different objects. Don't just stick the mesh in there. If you look at real-life objects, stuff usually doesn't just intersect. Instead, there is almost always some sort of connection point between the different objects. This should be reflected in your 3D model as well. And I'll show you a few examples of what I mean with this. So let's say you want to create some pipes. And those pipes are supposed to end up in a wall, right? So don't just stick them in there. Either make a little connector for each pipe, or make a little panel in the wall where all the pipes can go in. There are a lot of possibilities, and just make sure it makes sense. And similar to when you have cables coming out of a wall and going into some sort of object, make sure there is a connection where the cable comes out of the wall and where the cable goes into the object. Or let's say you have some kind of door that opens, and don't just put it edge to edge. Put a little simple hinge in there so it looks right when you open it. Stuff like this may seem super unnecessary in the moment, but it will make the big picture look so much better. Tip number 3. Don't let your topology direct your design. Back when I started modeling, I made this mistake a lot. Letting your topology direct where you place what kind of details on your model, and just overall making it as easy as possible to add details without destroying the topology, is definitely not something you should do. Instead, I think you should think the other way around. Think, where do I want to place what kind of detail and how can I adjust the topology to make this work as clean as possible? And of course, it's gonna be more work for you, but it will be worth it when you're satisfied, because the end result is just how you wanted it to be and not how it was the most easy to model. Tip number 4. Think outside of the box and don't be afraid of experimenting. So this somewhat ties into the last tip, but I think it's worth its own part anyway. So when you successfully blocked out your model and you want to start detailing it, don't be afraid of experimenting with different shapes. Let's say you want a panel. Don't just make it the same shape as the main object because it's the most easy way to just inset the face. Instead, think about some kind of shape that you think is cool and fits the object better to create a dynamic and interesting model, and use that as a panel shape. Or let's say you want to cut some sort of hole. Don't just make it square. Think of something more interesting and better looking than just a square hole. Or let's say you want to give your device some kind of antenna, and the most easy way would be just sticking it on top of it, right? But now you think, maybe this could look cool with a little hole, but I want you to stop right there. There is no but. Just try it. If you're afraid of messing up your model, simply copy the whole thing, move it down a bit and work on a copy. And this way you can always go back and experiment freely without worrying about undo steps or anything else. Tip number 5. Bevels. How and when to use what kind of bevels. So early in modeling I quite often asked myself, when should I just use Ctrl B to bevel and when should I use the handy modifier Blender gives us? So if you ask yourself the same thing sometimes, I can offer you an answer that works fine for me. For me there are two kinds of bevels, shape defining bevels and edge softening bevels. So let's talk about shape defining bevels first. As the name suggests, they are here to define our shape and direct our corners. I use the Ctrl B hotkey for those. So use them to give your object round corners or anything that directly changes the outline of your model. Remember, you can change the shape of your bevels by pressing P and moving your mouse. The edge softening bevels, on the other hand, are here to, you guessed it, soften our edges. I personally use the bevel modifier set to bevel white for this. Then you can just simply give the sharp edges you want to soften a bevel white value in the N panel, set up the modifier how you want it, and there we go, no more sharp edges. Tip number 6. Topology is situational. Alright, I know there are some people who will get angry about this, but quad-only topology is not always required, and n-gons are very fine sometimes. It's all situational and it all depends on how you want to use your model. So let's say you're modeling background props for a scene or a product for product rendering. Those objects will not need to move, and if they do, they only need to move as a whole object in the 3D space. So they don't deform and they don't bend. Those are static props. But let's say you're modeling a character for your video game, or a weird alien monster, no judgment here. Those will need to be rigged, and their topology will need to bend or deform in order to move. Those are dynamic props. Static props do not need all quad topology. The only thing that matters is, does it look good? Does it shade well? And does it fit my poly budget? Or does it have excessive dense topology? If those 3 questions are answered with yes, perfect, carry on, the model is fine. Dynamic models, on the other hand, also do not need all quad topology. But it's a lot more important to have the appropriate topology in areas where the model bends and deforms, and most of the time the appropriate topology in this case is quad topology. So it's a lot more important, but still not 100% required. Now, of course, there's also the situation where you want to subdivision your models, and with subdivision, quad topology is more important, but it's not always required. It helps with controlling the edge flow, avoiding artifacts, or preserving the shape of your object, but it's not 100% required. In the end, it all comes down to if your finished product looks good and how you want it to look, and if it performs well and within expectations. And if all those criteria are met, you're good. Don't worry about the topology anymore. Tip number 7. Reuse your objects to save memory and texture space. Alt-D. Probably one of the shortcuts I use the most when making a big scene or a big model. This is crucial to saving you a lot of time and resources. Duplicate your models instead of just creating a copy of them. Even if you plan to join it all into a single mesh in the end, separating a part you will reuse a lot, and duplicating it can save you a lot of work in the long run. But how does that save texture space? So let's say we're building the cockpit of a spaceship. And of course, it has hundreds of switches everywhere. Now, we're modeling one single switch, and then we will duplicate, not copy, duplicate it everywhere we want to have a switch. Great! Now, when it comes to texturing later, we will only need to UV and texture this one single switch. No more work required. No UV island stacking required. Nothing. And in the end, we can just join them all together into one big mesh, and they will automatically share the same UV space. Tip number 8. Build your own little gallery of parts you use often. This can be super helpful to speed up your work. Especially if you do a lot of hard surface modeling, there are certain things you will find yourself modeling over and over again. Things like screws, or nails, or wall connectors for cables, hinges, stuff like that. And next time you're modeling one of those things, you've already modeled it hundreds of times before, make it extra pretty, and then save it into your own private asset gallery so you can reuse it. Here's how you can set this up. First, create a new folder in a directory of your choice. Name it something like my own gallery or something. Then open a new Blender file. Delete everything and open up the asset browser. Now save that file into the directory you just created. Go to Edit, Preferences, File Paths and add the directory you just created as an asset library. To fill up our new library, you can either model some things you use often right in the new Blender file, or you can append stuff you've already modeled from different files. Then simply right-click the final asset in the outliner and click Mark as Asset. Now it should show up under the Current File tab. Now, everything in that Blender file we just created that gets marked as an asset will be available in every Blender file in the asset browser, as long as the path in the preferences is set up correctly. Tip number 9. Properly unwrapping objects and optimizing texture space. So, properly learning to unwrap my models is something I took quite long to learn. Back then I let the smart UV unwrap or Substance Painter do its thing and not care about it. And that was a mistake, because properly learning to UV unwrap and optimize the UV space on your model will make texturing models so much easier, and the final result will end up looking much better. And honestly, unwrapping hard surface models isn't that hard after all. You will be able to learn it. I won't make a whole tutorial on UV unwrapping right now, because there are some YouTube tutorials out there that explain it way better than I ever could. But I'll make sure to link some in the description that really helped me to get that aha moment about UV unwrapping. A few tips I can give you though is to always make sure your UV islands are able to be quadrified and don't have big holes in the middle. So quadrifying basically means deforming your UV island into a square or a rectangle. This is done in order to fit as much islands as possible in the texture space. Also, stacking UV islands where possible helps a lot too. So if you have parts of your model that will look the same, stack them on the UV space, because that leaves more area and more pixels for the other islands, which will give you more quality overall. I can really recommend Zen UV and UV Packmaster. They are two really great add-ons that greatly speed up the UV work and make it less tedious. It's amazing. Tip number 10. Clove Filter as an alternative to Clove simulations. I recently found this awesome feature in sculpting mode I didn't know of before. I personally really dislike Clove simulations in Blender. They never seem to work out just how I wanted. They flap around, they fly away, and yeah, that's it. But sometimes you still need Clove features on your model, and this is where this handy feature comes in. The Clove Filter. It is basically a mini Clove simulation on rails. First, let's create a simple plane. This will be our Clove. Now, subdivide it a few times to give it a good resolution. Now, we want to switch over to sculpting mode and search for the Clove Filter in the left side list of tools. Select it and open the N panel with the Tool tab selected. In the Tool tab, you can select different types of forces and set up some settings for the simulation. Then simply click and move your mouse in order to simulate the mesh. It will only simulate as long as you press the mouse button. but it just moves the whole mesh around right now. So let's get to the cool part. When you press M on your keyboard, you will enter mask mode. Let's draw a mask on the plane and mask out the edges of the clove. We can also add some kind of cool pattern to the mask to make more fancy clove. Basically, the black parts of the mesh will not move during the clove simulation. Let's switch back to the Clove Filter tool and try the different options again. There we go. This is a great alternative to clove simulations, and you can also work with shape keys to control and even animate the clove to some extent, like I did with this piece of foil around the engine on my spaceship. Tip number 11. Using Subdivision for organic or molded parts. Sometimes we need a smooth shape in hard surface modeling. For example, a molded plastic part or a piece of metal that has been deformed accordingly. And tweaking a mesh with proportional editing enabled sometimes just doesn't cut it. So the Subdivision modifier is just about perfect for that situation. I personally prefer to work with the Subdivision modifier active from the very beginning. So I basically set it up before modifying the mesh and then do changes with the modifier active, but that's something you will have to decide for yourself. A lot of people also prepare the mesh without the modifier active. Some useful tips for working with Subdivision. Add loop cuts and slide them to define the shape of your object. You can also use the mean vertex crease and mean crease values in the N panel under the Item tab to control how faces, edges and vertices react to the subdivision. Tip number 12. Using a lattice to deform objects and snap them to surfaces. This modifier has proven itself to be quite helpful for me in a lot of situations. So let's say you want to align a square cube to a curved surface. Instead of shrink wrapping the cube itself or some other solution, use a lattice modifier. I'll show you how to set this up. Here we got our cube. It is subdivided a few times to give it resolution to bend. In object mode, let's add a lattice object and use the menu in the properties panel to adjust it so it only covers the bottom of your mesh. Also, give it some more resolution. Now, click on your cube, shift-click on the lattice object and press Ctrl and P. Select Lattice Deform. Now the lattice object moves the cube around. So let's get to our curved wall over here. Take the lattice, rotate it 90 degrees, and now we can give the lattice object the shrink wrap modifier. Set it up properly, and voila, we can now move the lattice around the wall and our cube will adjust to the curvature. Tip number 13. Add small and easy idle animations to your models with drivers and keyframe F-curve interpolation. Adding small idle animations to your finished object can look super awesome when you decide to show off the model in a small video. And it's super easy to set up too. I'll show you two of my favorite tricks to bring some life into my objects. First, animating transforms with the frame expression. This works on every property you can add a driver to. Simply write #frame and press enter. Now the value of the property will go up depending on the speed of the frame rate. If you want to make it faster, multiply it by some number. If you want to slow it down, divide it by some number. This can be used to animate things like a fan spinning or a searchlight rotating. And second, using keyframe F-curve interpolation to make a looping animation. This works with everything you can keyframe. Blender has a neat feature where you can simply interpolate the F-curves of your keyframes to make them run forever. This can be used to create interesting animations that make your objects look more alive. So let's make a very simple example for this. Here we have a tube with this cube attached, and we can now simply keyframe this cube to go over here and back to its original position. It's important it goes back to its original position because the animation will be looping. If we want, we can also play around with the keyframe interpolation by pressing T to make it a little bit more fancy. And when we're done, we're gonna select all the keyframes, press Shift and E, and select Make Cyclic F Modifier. There we go. When we now press play, Our animation will loop as long as the scene is playing. Tip number 14. Plan ahead from the very beginning. When you model something with the intention of texturing it later, plan ahead. You can really shoot your future self in the leg with certain things, and it's a good idea to always keep your future UVs and textures in mind while modeling your object. And it's probably even more important to plan ahead and be aware of your texturing when you're UV unwrapping your model. So when you're putting in those seams, think about how you want to texture those parts of your model and plan your seams accordingly. Tip number 15. Flash tips. Here are some quick flash tips that aren't important enough to have their own part, but I still think they will be useful to some of you. Number 1. Use your 3D cursor in combination with the pivot menu to align stuff. You can use Shift and S to align your 3D cursor to various things like faces, edges or vertices. Combined with the pivot menu up here, set to 3D cursor, you can use this to perfectly align your objects. Number 2. Most of us probably know we can double tap G to slide vertices along an edge. But did you also know you can simply press C to unclamp this operation and move them in the other direction as well? Number 3. Increase your undo steps under Edit, Preferences, System to as much as your machine can handle to erase your past mistakes. Number 4. Use J to connect vertices while cutting the mesh. If you just put an edge between them with F, it won't actually cut the mesh and this will remain one single face. If you press J, however, it will cut the mesh as well. And last but not least, number 5. Use the dissolve functions to cleanly get rid of excessive edges and faces. This is a cleaner method than just simply deleting them and then having to deal with the mess they leave. Alright, that's it for today. I hope you guys were able to learn a thing or two from those tips. If so, a like would be greatly appreciated. Keep the grind going, take care, and until next time.